We should be talking a little bit.
What?
Good to go. Recording.
I said not to record yet.
Yeah, Ben, pay attention.
Are you recording?
I can delete.
Yeah, don't, I need to put you in your seat and give you instructions first.
So I'll have to get out of my seat to go back to him.
Yeah.
Okay, that's fair.
You're going to be over here.
Got some stuff you don't want in the recording, huh? Want me to right here?
Well, one more, but just back right there, that chair right there. Yep. Okay, so I don't know if we're going to do the Q&A at the end. If you guys think of things during it that sounds like a question people might have asked, go ahead and ask that. It won't be on the mic, but I can repeat it and at least get that answered. Because if I just go through the slides, we'll be done in 45 minutes.
Right.
So I've got to ad lib and throw stories on this. Because I think that night we finished right around an hour and 40 minutes, but there were a lot of questions at the end.
Yeah.
So let's do questions, and we'll just do the best we can with it.
Probably get a mic.
And what you could do is you could say, a question that is often asked,
Yep.
and then just run with it, and just do your own, ask yourself a question.
Yeah. Okay. And then, so whether you're looking at your phone or doing something else, I don't care. I just need bodies to look at. So most of the time, I'll be looking at these two. But when I come back to here, I'm going to be going back and forth between you and the screen.
Yeah.
Okay. And I think that's it. And I just need to say good evening instead of good morning.
Good evening. That's right. Good evening.
Good evening, not in Dracula style.
Am I ready to record?
Yep, go for it.
This will be our just in case audio right here. I'm all about just in case.
Oh, you're recording with that too?
Just in case.
Okay.
Do we need a microphone, us, for questions?
No.
Can you hear me?
Well, good evening. For the last couple of weeks, we have talked about anxiety, depression, and trauma. Those are the big three. Those are the ones that people most often walk through my door for. Anxiety is the biggest of those three. So anxiety and depression are in the mood spectrum. Mood disorders is what we call them. And that's what brings a lot of people through the door. Trauma is probably even bigger than those two, but it's underreported. All of this has to do with how our brain works. And so tonight, what we're going to be talking about is how the brain works, all of the things that I've learned over the last 20 plus years doing continuing education. I couple years ago, probably 5 years ago now, picked brain stuff, that's my term for it, brain stuff, because it's an underutilized or understudied part of what we do. Somebody said once we're the only industry that does not study the organ that we treat. So people get trained to be counselors, therapists, but there are no brain classes in our schooling. Imagine if you went to a doctor and a doctor treating you for a broken bone never studied that in medical school. Would you trust that doctor? Probably not. That's why I like this subject, because I use it every day in what I do. So that's what we're going to study tonight. I do have to give a word of disclaimer, though. If there are any doctors and nurses in the room, I am not a doctor or nurse, so this is not meant to be an insult to your training. This is just what I've learned over the last several decades and passing it on. So let's get into it. And I just said that. So we've had this chart up every week in this series so far, and I wanted to bring it up yet again, because when we're talking about the things that get people in my office, these are the three categories that I think about. Where does it fit? Is it biopsychosocial damage? Is it suffering? Is it sin? Is it a combination of these three? Even when we're talking about brain health, brain stuff, this is still applicable, because when people come in, they're dealing with one of these three or more than one of these three, but their brain is involved. Our brain is involved in everything we do, so we have to understand where it's coming from. So, brain basics. There's a lot. And again, this is just my crib sheet version. There are 4 lobes, basically 4 regions of the brain, left and right hemispheres, lots of structures and regions within those hemispheres. Left and right hemisphere, people always talk about being left-brained or right-brained. It's neither one of those. That's just a simple way to say it. There's all kinds of duplication from one hemisphere to the other. When somebody gets a TBI, a traumatic brain injury, and let's say a nail goes into somebody's skull, it's going to damage portions of that side of the brain. Well, guess what? The other side of the brain picks up the slack. And stuff that was in that area, memories or whatever in that area of the brain, can shift sides, and the person can live a fully functional, healthy life. And everybody's amazed. That's the brain that God made. It truly is an amazing thing. Okay, gray matter and white matter. I always get these mixed up, and it could be the reverse of these. This is just the way I think about it. Gray matter is like the transportation, like the roads in your brain, okay? White matter is storage of information, okay? So think roads and filing cabinets. When I do 2 + 2 = 4, and I went to Vancouver for vacation, I just used gray matter to go retrieve stuff in the white matter. That's how our brain works every second of every day. Now, guess what we've had a corresponding leap in the last decade and a half? Alzheimer's. Alzheimer's is the roads don't exist, but the information is there. And guess how that was, guess what the biggest contributor was to that thing happening? Cell phones. Because when I look at my cell phone and I see that blue dot and I look at that screen, whether it's a cell phone or a TV or a computer screen, I'm killing gray matter in my brain. One of those two, gray matter, white matter, whichever one it is. I'm killing those things. Not the information, the access points. So the gray matter is being destroyed, but leaving the information there. So there's just no road to that filing cabinet. So that's how technology, and technology is part of what we're going to talk about tonight, that's how technology is intertwined in all of this brain stuff. So I talked about the blue dot. When you look at that, your phone, and that little notification light blinks off and on, telling you there's something there waiting for you, guess what happens in your brain? You get a little shot of dopamine. And if you do that 10, 20, 30 times a day, you're getting all these little microbursts of dopamine in your brain, hooking your brain to, oh, I want to look at that dot even more. That's how dopamine works. It's called the pleasure chemical because it makes us feel good based on what we just did. We're going to talk about it a little bit more here in a minute, but that's how technology is hijacking our brains to do things that we normally wouldn't have done before cell phones existed. So, next one, glial cells. They're like little janitors in our brain. When we go to sleep at night, these little cells come out of their closet and they start sweeping up the floor in our brain because during the day, when we do 2 + 2 = 4 or talk to somebody or do some high complex stuff, every time a thought or however it happens in the brain goes from one axon to the other, from one nerve ending to the other in our brain, it leaves a little dust trail from that act happening. And that little dust trail falls on the floor in our brain and stays there. However, that stuff is toxic. It's supposed to move, it's not supposed to stay. So then at night, when we go to sleep, these little glial cells come out of their closet and they start sweeping up all these toxins, the toxic dust in our brain, on the floor of our brain. They sweep it up and get rid of it. That's their job. And it takes them a minimum of 7 hours to do their job. Okay? So all those people who say they only need 4 or 5 hours of sleep, not all those toxins are getting swept up. And if those toxins are allowed to stay on the floor in our brain night after night after night because somebody's getting less than 7 hours of sleep, that doesn't mean you don't need more. But if you're getting less than 7 hours of sleep, you're building up toxins that create brain fog, fatigue, concentration problems, memory loss. All of that stuff happens from that toxic buildup. That's why glial cells are so important. Hormones. There's tons of different hormones in our brain and in our bodies. Some of the biggest ones, the most important ones, are dopamine, oxytocin, and serotonin. Again, I'm not a doctor. I'm not a hormone expert. Other people can handle that. Dopamine, we're around dopamine-producing activities every day. Anything we do that we find pleasurable means we find it pleasurable because dopamine is being secreted into our brain. Oxytocin is called the bonding chemical. It is a hormone that is released when we do things of a certain nature. And I'll show you a slide toward the end tonight with one of those. But oxytocin bonds two people together. Dopamine and oxytocin can work together. It bonds people together through certain activities. Even a hug can produce oxytocin if it's 20 seconds or longer. Oxytocin is released when a mother is breastfeeding a newborn and they're in that 2-foot distance space. Oxytocin is being released in the mother's body, which bonds her to the baby, makes her want to care for and take care of that baby even more than she naturally would. It's also released when we have an orgasm. It's also released when we engage in relational activities that we find that we like. Okay? Serotonin. Serotonin is closely linked to depression, lack of serotonin. Guess where serotonin is produced in your body? Yep, in your gut. In your gut. So that big, fat, lazy couch lay that happens on Thanksgiving, and we want to watch football and fall asleep, at least I do. Serotonin is being produced in your gut, and then it goes to your brain. It's not produced in the brain, it's produced in our gut. So anybody who has digestion issues or things like that in their digestive tract or gut area, they're going to have less serotonin than they need, which is going to cause other problems. Okay, this is a picture of the brain. It's a very simple version of how to think about the brain. We talked earlier about the triune brain theory, cortex limbic stem. This adds one of those, a new area to that. So I'll just go up from the bottom. So the pink area at the bottom of the picture, that's the brain stem. That's the fight, flight, and freeze, the amygdala. All of the basic autonomic functions of the body are handled there. It's what keeps us alive without us having to think about it. So right now, are you thinking about breathing? Are you thinking about beating your heart? Because if you had to do all that, we'd all be dead. This is the part of our brain that handles that for us. The next one, the yellow one, is the diencephalon. That's the area of the brain in charge of movement. We haven't really talked about that a lot, but that's what that is. The next one is the limbic system. That's the lighter blue area. That's all about emotion, regulation, and relationships, both people to people and spatial relationships. That part of the brain does not do any thinking. It can't do basic math. Only our brainstem can do very basic stuff. But the next layer up, the cortex, the neocortex, is the newest part of our brain and the thinking part of our brain. So all of that purple area is information storage and the ability to analyze and think things through. So that's a basic outline of how the brain works, of the areas of the brain that make things happen. So God made an amazing brain. This is, we don't even understand the fingernail of what our brains can do. I was driving down the road one day, going to work, and they came on the radio and they said, researchers have found out that men and women are different. Now, this was before COVID, before all the stuff that we're dealing with in the news right now, but it's like, okay, well, you know, the Bible told us that like 2,000 years ago. God knew this a long time ago. Why are y'all taking so long to catch up? People want to study things they don't understand. And if people reject God and the Bible and what all that says, they're going to think that they can go figure it out for themselves. Well, I'm just going to take a look at what God said in his word and what he's told us and start there. And that's going to give me, evidently, a 2,000-year head start. So God made an amazing brain. It is still a single-tasking machine. A lot of people talk about being able to multitask, do 2, 3, 4, 5 things at a time. No, your brain does one thing at a time. It can just do them rapidly in succession. Or it can switch from this one thing to that one thing back and forth faster than you can imagine. Okay? One of my first introductions to this was when I met my wife. Before we were married, we were at her house, and I'm an only child. My wife is the youngest of 6 sisters. And so she had a bunch of her sisters and nieces over. I was still meeting all of the family. She broke me in one family at a time. And so we were sitting in the kitchen, and there was a window right here next to me. I'm sitting here, she's sitting there in a corner where 2 walls meet with a window right here, and behind me is the kitchen. And there's like 4 or 5 people in the kitchen, and they're making food and talking, whatever. But she's participating in my conversation and theirs, like 3 different ones going on behind me. And we're talking, and she would pot shot an answer into one conversation, with a glance, then look back at me, keep talking with me, then pot shot another question or comment into another one. And I'm like, what's going on? I couldn't even keep track of our conversation. And she called that multitasking. Well, guess what? A lot of people do that. But our brain still only does one thing at a time. And usually those things are emotion or logic. It cannot do both at the same time. So if somebody is highly emotional, ain't no logic going to get in there. I'm from the South, I can say ain't. So if somebody's really, really hyped up, emotional, crying, even happy, whatever, they can't compute logic at that point. If somebody's distraught about something, they're crying, they're upset, and you're trying to talk them to a different place of thinking, number one, don't. It's not going to work. Number two, their brain can't do that at that moment. When their emotion is up to here, logic's not going to be able to get in the door. You've got to wait for them to calm down the emotion so that logic can come back into the equation. And I see that all the time in my office, all the time. When somebody goes into a lot of emotionality, I just stop and wait. I don't wait 20 minutes. I can't do that. We'd never get anything done. But they're being highly emotional. Usually what I do is ask them more emotional questions and get them more emotional. There's an old saying in my job, the healing is in the feeling. So the more feelings I can get somebody to push out, the more processing their brain does on that subject. I'm not asking you guys to try that. That's not your job. That's my job. But that's how it works. We can do emotion or logic, not at the same time. Same thing with kids. If your child is highly emotional, upset because they didn't get the snack they want, because they can't go to Johnny's house, because of brother hit them with a baseball bat, whatever it is. I mean, if it's a wooden one, you might have to go to the hospital. But if it's a plastic one, they're just upset. You're not going to talk them out of it. Be patient. Wait. Let them express their emotion. Okay? And then give them time to calm down before you try to get logic back in there. And that's where the 20 minutes comes from. They've actually studied this, that it takes an average of 20 minutes to calm down out of high emotionality. High emotionality is called being flooded. It could be anger, it could be fear, it could be sadness, it could be anything. But that emotion is up to here. That's a state of being flooded. That means you can't get anything else in, and it takes an average of 20 minutes for that to come down so you can get logic back in there. Now, that's for adults. That does not work with kids. It could be longer because that's how kids process. And this comes from John Gottman. He's the leading researcher in marriage relationships, couple relationships in the world. He's at University of Washington. And his stuff is phenomenal because he was originally a mathematician who applied math to what his wife was doing. She's a psychologist, and that's how they developed what's called the Gottman method. The kind of the leading guy in brain science right now is Bruce Perry. A lot of the slides in this tonight, a lot of the material is from Bruce Perry. He is the guy for brain stuff, and I would love to have him come to Kalispell and speak both to public and to professionals, but he's like, $60,000 for an hour. So that ain't happening anytime soon. His stuff is the best. So this is a chart of brain activity in a developing child. So that first picture all the way to the left is of a newborn baby. There is some brain activity going on, but look what happens in the first couple of months of that baby developing. Look at the growth. And then you get all the way out to 2 years. You go from almost a white canvas to almost a black canvas. That's how much brain activity is ramping up during the first 2 years of a baby's life. Now, look what happens between 2 years and 5 years. Where did all of it go? Here's what happens. There are 2 or 3 times in the developing child's brain where they have an exuberant growth of physical structure in the brain. So the actual building of dendrites and axons and synapses and all that kind of stuff. All that stuff gets built, and then your brain goes through a pruning process. And this is the if you don't use it, you lose it concept. So when do they say the best time to teach a child a foreign language is? before 5 years old, because they have the physical structure to absorb that new information. And if they learn a different language between the ages of 2 and 5, they will never forget it. Okay, even baby sign language, we did that with some of our kids. Foreign languages, even math. If you teach that to them between the ages of 2 and 5, they'll never forget it, because they're taking advantage of this extra building that's happening in their brain. And there's so much capacity there that if it doesn't get utilized, it will get pruned away. So this happens before 5 years old, and then it happens again somewhere before, right around 12 to 14 years old. And I think I have a slide on that. So one of the parts of the brainstem is the amygdala. And there are two of them. They're two little football-shaped structures. And if you put your fingers behind your ears, that little divot where your jaw meets your skull, just go straight in from there and you'll get really close to them. They are all about keeping you alive through fear. Okay? Their main job, when a baby is born, their main job is to make that baby afraid of something so it stays away from it. That's what they do. So the amygdala, as part of the brainstem, is the thing that's in charge up until about 11 to 13 years old, which is that next section. At about 11 to 13 years old, 11 for girls, 13 for boys, that structure is in charge of the brain, because it's the part of the brain that is the most developed. And what it does is tell them everything about survival, which means we can make a decision right now and 2 minutes later make a completely different decision about the same subject. I want Wheaties, I want Captain Crunch. Two different decisions very close to each other that are not the same. For us, as adults, as parents, drives us nuts. For them, makes total sense, because they're surviving one moment to the next. They're in survival mode. Those two moments do not have to match, do not have to make sense with each other. They're just surviving. So when they do that, they're making sense to themselves. To us, we want to go, scream in a closet or something. So that structure at around 11 years old for girls, 13 for boys, that structure, or that set of structures, finishes developing and hands off control of the brain to the next set of structures that are the closest to being developed. That's how they move out of survival mode. And again, to us, it drives us nuts. It's like chaos. But to them, they're just surviving one moment to the next. And look what happens right after that. We have another, around 12 to 14 years old, girls and boys, another time period of exuberant growth in the brain. Let me give you a story to illustrate this. So my 3 oldest out of my 7 kids is girls. And when number 1 hit about 13 to 14 years old, that means number 2 would have been, so let's say she was 13. Number 2 was 11, and number 3 was 8. So the 13-year-old, something would happen, and she would go, about it. And the 11-year-old would go, what? That's like nothing. And so would the 8-year-old. So then time passes. Now, 2 years later, the 13-year-old is 15, the 11-year-old is 13, and the 8-year-old is now 11, or 10. And so now something happens, and the 15-year-old goes, wah! The 13-year-old goes, wah! And the 10-year-old goes, what? That's nothing. That's the difference, and that's how much emotionality is involved in this exuberant growth. When these exuberant growth periods happen, it's like chaos in their brain. Okay, they call them the terrible twos. Why? Not because the kid is terrible, because there's 5 million things going on in their brain. There's chaos happening in their brain, and they can't keep up with it all. Same thing at this time period. 12 to 14 years old, depending on who we're talking about, it's chaos in their brain. There's too much going on. They can't handle it all. So everything becomes emotional. Everything becomes extreme. And as parents, we need to understand that and have some patience and some grace with our kids, because if we don't know that, if we don't pay attention to that, we're going to lose sight of, oh, that's right, their brain is still developing. They can't do and think what I do and think, so I need to be gracious with them. That makes a huge difference in how we parent our kids, because we're not reacting to what we think is chaos or what we think is not reasonable, whereas they're just still surviving or going through overload in their head. The frontal lobe of the brain, so right about where the front of your ears, right here, the jawline, just draw a line straight down through your head at about that point. Everything in front of that is your frontal lobe, okay, up here in the top of your brain. That part of your brain deals with personality, behavior, emotion, judgment, planning, problem solving, speech, body movement, intelligence, concentration, self-awareness, all kinds of stuff that we need to live everyday life, okay? But that portion of your brain is the last one to develop, because our brain forms bottom up and inside out. So it grows like this, okay? And the last part of the brain to develop is right here behind our forehead, called the prefrontal cortex. It's the last portion of our brain to develop. That happens at around 25 years of age, and it's where we practice decision making, judgment, high emotion regulation. All of that stuff happens right here behind our forehead at 25 years old, and we let those people drive and vote, okay? No offense to the younger adults in the room, your brains just aren't there yet, okay? So here's the way I put it. When you make Jell-O and you've put all the pieces together and you're just about to put it in the fridge so it can set up and harden, that's what an under 25-year-old brain looks like. It's just not all done yet. It's not cooked. It's not a fully baked cookie. They're thinking with Jell-O. It's just not solid. We had, I was doing a workshop in Arizona. I was working at a therapeutic boarding school, and we had parents of past students who come and help us run these workshops, because other parents will listen to parents more than professionals anyway. And there was a mom sitting in the back of the room. A bunch of stuff was going on, but my boss and I were sitting there talking with this mom, and she said, and we were talking about this, and she said, yeah, it was amazing. Her daughter had been in the program years and years earlier, and she said, my daughter graduated the program, went to college, bailed out of college, got into a relationship, bailed out of the relationship. She was in and out of all kinds of things, and then the day she turned 25, she was living with mom. Mom was divorced. She was listening. She came down the stairs. The day she turned 25, her 25th birthday, she came down the stairs, and before she even spoke at breakfast, mom could tell there was a difference. From one day to the next, mom could tell there was a difference in her daughter. And my boss looked at her and said, yeah, it's like somebody flipped on a light switch. And she said, yeah, it's like the lights came on. That's how different it is, thinking-wise, presentation-wise, just how things are handled or whatever. From one day to the next, when that part of the brain finishes, it's a light switch moment. It happens that easily and quickly. The last note on there, the frontal lobe and the cortex, the growth in these areas happens through relationships, our relationships with people and our relationship with objects, okay? The way that happens is through, in horse land, it's called cow paths. In science land, it's called neural pathways. We build neural pathways by doing something repetitively. So, parents, do you ever get mad at your kids and yell at them? And have you done that like, umpteen zillion times? You're creating a pathway in your brain which makes it easy to go down that path all the time. Here's why. You go out to a horse pasture or a cow pasture. What do you see in the ground? A cow path. And where does it go typically? Water trough. Well, if the cow or the horse walks that path every day to that water trough, that path is going to be there forever because you've got how many cows or horses beating that path and going to get the water, and they're doing it every day. Grass is never going to grow there again because that cow path is etched into the ground. The same thing happens in our brain. When we do something repetitively, good or bad, it etches a neural pathway in our brain. And it's there forever, which means it's always accessible. It doesn't mean we're going to choose it, but it's accessible. Now, what is our goal? Our goal is to lay down a new neural pathway right next to that one that is a better choice. So instead of yelling at the kid, now we go to them, we put our hands on their shoulders, we get down on one knee, and we talk to them. Both pathways are available. Now we have a choice, but we still have to choose. Yeah.
Is it true that it takes about 27 days to create a new neural pathway?
So the 28-day thing, you're talking about habits. Yes, there is science to that. As far as neural pathways, I don't know if we can call a neural pathway a habit or not. Because if I do a certain thing for 28 days and then I stop doing it on day 29, it's likely to go away. I'm talking about neural pathways that are etched in there and they're never going to go away. So neural pathways probably take longer than 28 days. You could probably have the start of it within that 28 days. But imagine how many years cows have been going to that water trough. That's the long-term patterns are what create neural pathways. How long does it take to create a neural pathway? I don't have an answer for that. Sorry. So it's relationship driven. So when somebody comes into my office and they're struggling with anxiety or depression, what am I likely to tell them to go do? Go have a relationship, which is going to cause them what? Anxiety or depression. So the answer to a lot of these issues that people walk in the door with is the very thing that frightens them or the very thing they're struggling with. And they think, they oftentimes come through my door and say, I have this problem, I need to take it away. And sometimes my answer is, no, we need to educate you on how your brain works or how a relationship works because that thing is going to help you solve your problem. That's the first time that's ever happened. And that freaks people out when they say, wait a minute, you want me to do the thing that scares me the most? Yeah, I want you to, because you need to learn through doing it that it's not going to be harmful, and doing it perhaps a different way is going to give you different results. The growth in our brain happens through those relationships with people. The relationship I create with a client in my office, but the relationship that everybody has with their family members, their friends, everything else. You look at the brain scans of a person who has a lot of friends, a lot of family, and you compare that to a brain scan of somebody who is a hermit and they don't have a whole lot of family or friends or they don't spend time with them, you're going to see two totally different worlds in those pictures. You're going to see one brain lit up like a Christmas tree and another brain with not a lot going on, especially if that's the way that person has lived most of their life, because they haven't had the relationships that cause the growth in the brain.
Question.
Yeah.
If I was an introvert, would I take offense to that statement?
No, I'm an introvert, okay? And introvert is not about do I like people or do I have a lot of friends or do I like being around people. It's about how I recharge my batteries when I'm drained. Extroverts recharge their batteries by being around people. Introverts recharge their batteries by being alone. But it has nothing to do with whether or not I like people, or I have friends, or I want friends, or any of that. It's just a preference in how I do things. Whoa. Lots of mistakes tonight. Okay, regulation. Regulation means how I get myself to baseline, okay? A lot of regulation happens even just with breathing. We can regulate our body physically and emotionally just by breathing. The best form of regulation is bottom up, okay? That means it starts in the brainstem and goes up through the layers of the brain. When I do horse therapy, the first thing I'm looking for when a client gets on a horse and we're doing certain exercises, I'm looking at their connection to the horse. Because if their connection with the horse isn't stable, none of the rest of what we do is going to work. And the connection of the horse starts in the brainstem. And the second part is the diencephalon. Those two areas of the brain are going to show me how they're playing out with the horse. They're going to show me whether that person is regulated and if they're going to be a good team with the horse that day. Okay? So regulation that begins in the bottom of the brain and moves up is best. That's what I just described. We're looking for that bottom-up regulation, because if they can't get in sync with the horse, with their body, they're not going to be able to think, because their brain and their body is going to be fighting the horse. Rhythmic and patterned input is what we're looking for to create regulation. So when a rider is on horseback, the movement of the horse is creating enough regulation for them if they're relaxed into it. If they're fighting it, it's not going to work. But if they're relaxed and they're in tune with the horse is going to give them enough regulation. Okay? I got to get my marker for this. This was probably 10 years ago I first started seeing this. There are teachers in classrooms that will use classical music, so music without words. They will use classical music to regulate their classroom. And it happens like this. So some of you want to dance right now, okay? Now, notice how that made you feel, your body and your mind, compared to this. Did you like that second one? No. Most everybody doesn't like the second one because it's chaos. It's not regulated. It's not patterned. It's not rhythmic. That's what our brain likes, okay? They did an experiment once. They walked out into a horse pasture with a flat drum and a mallet, and they just walked out in the middle of this horse pasture. There were 5 horses, and they just started beating that drum, just a regular beat. All the horses came to it, and they just put their noses right down at the edge of the drum. They were holding it flat and just beating it. All 5 horses, their noses were right here. And then they stopped. And the horses went. They started nudging the drum with their noses, saying, do that again, we like that. And so they started beating it, and they all just calmed right down. Because they like that rhythmic, patterned input. Regulation versus dysregulation. When we are regulated, our bodies are calm, our brains are calm, everything's functioning the way it should be. When we are dysregulated, things aren't happening the way they should be. Chaos is happening. And a person can wake up in the morning and be regulated or dysregulated. So sometimes I've had clients who wake up and the first thing they have to do is do something, breathing or otherwise, to get themselves regulated because of what they just dreamed about 15 minutes ago or less. That dream caused enough stress that waking up, first thing in the morning, they're dysregulated all over the place, and now they got to do something to get themselves in a more stable place before they even get out of bed. So rhythmic and patterned input is what we're looking for. Okay, child versus adult. Children do not regulate themselves the same way that adults do. Adults regulate their emotions with their thinking. In other words, when our emotions run away with us, we're supposed to use, Bible even talks about this, we're supposed to use our thinking to override our emotions. Okay? Children don't do that. When children don't like what's in their head, what they're thinking, they use their emotions or emotional displays or expressions to override what they're thinking in their head. Okay? Part of that's because the limbic system, the part of our brain that handles emotions, develops before our neocortex, which is where all our critical thinking happens. Remember, bottom up and inside out. So the limbic system is a more fully formed structure before the cortex is. So they're going to use their emotions to override their thinking. So when you say, no, you can't go to Johnny's house, we get a fit. No, you can't have that for a snack. Well, why not? High chair tyrant. That's why. They don't like what's going on in their head. Basically, what's going on in their head is, well, I want that thing. Why would my parent not give it to me? I mean, I don't get that. That's how they're thinking. And so it's not computing, so you're going to get an emotional display. Regulation best occurs through rhythmic, patterned, repetitive input. Okay? Next time you feel a little off, try my marker tip. Just go find something hard enough to a small object and a surface and just create that patterned input and just do that for a little bit and see what happens. It's amazing how calming that is. I've done it many times. Okay, so my first introduction to brain science was a horse therapy training I went to in Tucson, Arizona. This was in 2015. I think it was 2015 or 16. And a therapeutic boarding school for young teenage girls I was working at, they lost their horse therapist, and the owner came to me and said, hey, I want you to be my horse therapist. And I looked at her and I said, I don't know anything about horses. And she said, I'll pay for your training because you're good with kids and therapy and stuff. So she paid for my training. I went down to Arizona, 3-day workshop. Had to do a bunch of video training and stuff before I went down there, and learned a ton about the brains of people and the brains of horses, which aren't shaped the same, but they function the same. And it's amazing how many parallels there are between how the brain of a horse works and how the brain of a human works. Okay? One of the experiences I had down there was when you approach a horse, the horse knows you're there, and so they'll react to whatever's going on inside of you, okay? If you are walking up to a horse and you're within 25 feet, if you're walking up to a horse and you think something that gives you a burst of anger or fear or sadness or something like that, if you just think that thing, the horse is going to go, it's like they got shot and they back up because they felt that wave of emotional energy coming off you. Now imagine getting on the back of a horse and trying to do something and you're having those kind of thoughts fire off. The horse is not going to want you on their back. So I was at this training and they said, okay, go up to, we would do a lecture in the morning and practice in the afternoon. So got all the lecture stuff that afternoon. I went out to the horse and I walked up to the horse. The horse was eating a pile of hay. Now the horse had been out there all morning. That hay had been there all morning. There had been 2 or 3 people in the pen with the horse before me. The horse never went to the hay. I walk into the arena, the horse goes straight to the hay. And I walk right up to the horse. Horse's head's right here. I'm practically standing on the hay. Never moves. Just eats the whole time. So I back up. I think about it a little bit. And so I go up to the horse again. I try all kinds of things. I start clapping. I start waving my hands. I start, hey, hey, hey. Horse never moves. And I could not figure out what was going on. So right after that, we went to lunch. I talked with another student during lunch, came back after lunch, and I said, I think I figured out what was going on. And this is everybody together. We hadn't gone back outside yet. And I said, I am 6'3", and I don't want to intimidate people. So when I was out there with a horse, I shut everything down on the inside. And she said, okay, that might be why. Let's see what happens when you go back out there and you don't shut everything down on the inside. So I go outside, go into the pen, same horse, still eating the hay. And I go out there. I don't shut everything down internally. And the horse is reacting and doing everything I'm asking the horse to do. Just because I didn't shut down everything on the inside, I allowed everything out. I allowed emotion and everything I was thinking and everything out. I was not ghosting. I was not turning everything off like I did that morning. It made a huge difference. So I go through all this training and I come back. One of the very first days that I did horse therapy at this ranch, we had a girl on horseback. We were at an indoor arena. This was in February, I think. Indoor arena, 5 horses, probably 4 or 5 staff along one of the walls. A girl gets on the back of a horse, and she's just doing a circle in the middle of the arena, and these other 4 horses are down at one end of the indoor arena. It's a huge indoor arena. And all of a sudden, the horse she's riding on rears up on back legs. All the other horses come down and start doing basically a tornado around that horse. And everybody's in shock. The horse wrangler goes out, goes into all these horses doing chaos, grabs the reins, pulls the horse down, and starts calming that horse down, which calmed all the other horses down. We got the girl off. She was about 12 or 13, I think. Came over to the side and said, what were you thinking about? And she said, I had a phone call with my parents last night that really made me angry, and today I'm so upset about it. Look what the horses did. The horses reacted to all of that energy coming off of her. Emotional energy, thoughts, everything. Because a horse is receptive to all that within 25 feet. That's how much energy that person was giving off. Now, horses are very interesting. I deal a lot with people who've gone through trauma, and we talk a lot about dissociation. Dissociation, not disassociation. Those are 2 different things. Dissociations is the thing where you ever heard somebody tell a tragic story like from up in the corner, and they're telling it from a different point of view? They're dissociated. That's what that means. So horses, domesticated horses, spend 95% of their life dissociated. That means 9.5 out of every 10 minutes of their life, they are that's all they do. And for 30 seconds out of every 10 minutes, they're like, it's a sunny day. I'm going to go over to that pasture today. I saw some new grass over there I'm going to go munch on today. Going to go do that. And hopefully one of my buddies will go with me. And for 30 seconds out of every 10 minutes. They are dissociated because they've been trained to, okay, whatever a farmer tells me to do, that's what I'm going to do. That's dissociation. It's automatic pilot, okay? People can do the same thing. I had a lady in my office, worked with her for a couple years. In the very beginning of our work together, she would dissociate 30 plus times a session. That means once every 2 minutes, because I do hour sessions. So once every 2 minutes, she was dissociating. That means her brain was checking out, but her eyes were open and she was talking to me, but she was gone. And it took me a long time to catch it. And when I would catch it, I would stop talking and wait for her to come back, because it's just like this wave goes over their face, their eyes blink, and all of a sudden they narrow their focus and they look at you. Kind of like, did you catch me? And I say, hey, you're back, where'd you go? And then we talk about dissociation and how easily it happens, okay? So it's a feature of trauma especially, but we go through it every day. Have you ever driven from point A to point B, you arrived safely, you made all the correct turns, but you don't remember the drive? That's dissociation. Have you ever sat and watched a TV show? You're in the chair, looking at the TV, the show starts, maybe it's a 30-minute sitcom kind of show, and then 24 to 26 minutes later, the credits are rolling, and your eyes were on the screen the whole time, but you don't remember the episode. That's dissociation. You ever seen a cat sitting on a counter or something, and there's a wall here, and their head is facing into the corner, and they don't move for like an hour, and their eyes are open? They're dissociated. Their brain is gone, their body's there, they're staring in the corner, but they're gone. That's dissociation. Sometimes we do it as a survival technique. Sometimes we just check out. It's not solely associated with trauma. People can do it for a number of reasons, okay? So as parents, we oftentimes want our children to just do what we tell them to do, okay? We want compliance. Maybe we've had a hard day. Maybe we are dealing with something difficult in our life. Maybe we just want to have some downtime, and we need our children to obey. Well, guess what? Children don't always obey. They're still learning that. Compliance, if we're seeking compliance with our child, we are creating dissociation. Remember what I told you about horses? If you break a wild horse, you bring it into compliance. You domesticate that horse into compliance. Farmer walks out, puts a saddle on the back or a rope over the neck, the horse goes into compliance mode. They're going to do whatever the farmer or the rancher asks them to do, because they've been trained to do that. How were they trained to do that? Through compliance. How much time do horses spend in dissociation? 95%. Do we want our children to spend 95% of their life in dissociation because we ask for compliance? No, we don't want that. Compliance is dissociation. If we just seek compliance with our children, we are asking them to dissociate, just like a horse. What we want, and this sounds counterintuitive, what we want is conflict. Conflict is relationship. Think about it this way. If you're walking down the streets of some city you've never been to before and you get shoulder bumped walking down the sidewalk, are you going to start a fight with the person? No. You're going to say, excuse me, and keep walking, even if it wasn't your fault. Okay? That relationship, that person doesn't mean anything to you. You're never going to be in that city again. You're never going to see that person again. No big deal. Somebody shoulder bumps you walking down the hallway in your own house, you're going to say something about it, because that relationship is more important to you, has more meaning to you. You're invested in it much more than a stranger on the street. So that relationship means something. We assign value to the outcome. So how do we build that relationship? Same way you build a muscle. You go to the gym, you lift weights, you're ripping muscle to make more muscle to make it stronger. Same thing happens in relationships. The more conflict we go through in relationships, the more we prove whether that relationship is there for us or not. Relationships are built the same way muscle is, through conflict. Now, if all you have is conflict in relationships, or a certain relationship, probably not a great relationship, because it does take two to make that relationship happen. That's not what I'm saying. In parenting our kids, conflict is where the growth happens. Just like we talked about in our brains earlier, growth happens through relationship. Relationship grows through conflict. Okay, think about it like this. If everything was always hunky-dory in a brand new relationship and there was never any conflict, how trusting of that relationship would you be? Probably not very, because it's too good to be true. Because people aren't perfect, people make mistakes, and we grow through conflict, through finding out how much that person is there for us, how invested they are in the things that we do. With horses, I talked about if you're within 25 feet of them, they're going to know you're there. Because horses have a 25-foot radius from their heart that has it's kind of like a magnetic presence meter. If you're within if you or anything else is within 25 feet of their heart, they're going to know you're there. Horses are an animal of prey. That means they're afraid that anything that moves wants to take a bite out of their rump. So they're always going to point their head at you, and they're always going to know where you are. And if you are giving off anger or sadness or fear, they're going to want to get away from you because they don't want to be around that. That is unpredictable to them. People have the same thing at 5 feet. If you're within 5 feet of another person, you're going to feel some degree of what they're feeling. Okay? Think about it like this. When we're talking about something important, do we decrease the distance between us and another person, or do we increase it? We decrease it. We get closer. We want to be within 5 feet. There's something to that level of closeness and that amount of input that subject needs closeness to be talked about. When I give my kids a hug before they go to bed, or we're talking about something serious, I get closer. I get right up next to them. Sometimes I give them a hug and we talk while they're in the hug. Sometimes it's a different version of that. But we do that within 5 feet. A mother and a baby, always within 5 feet. Okay? So if you want to learn more about that, you can go to heartmath.com, and they actually have all kinds of training and devices and things like that that demonstrate that magnetic space. But it has something to do with our hearts, the way they're built physically, and how they give off whatever signal it is. I'm not that kind of scientist. Okay, personality. Personality is generally set by 5 years old, but it may not be seen until later. Personality is about preference. It's not about, are you a fun person? Are you a loud person? No, it's about preference. How do you prefer things to be? You can do it other ways, but you have a preference, okay? The question earlier was about introvert versus extrovert. That introvert versus extrovert is part of personality, and that's a feature of my preferences, okay? I'm an introvert, and my personality is, one of the features of my personality is I don't like people and I don't like emotions, but I'm a counselor. So obviously I can make up for or make accommodations for the parts of my personality that don't prefer my job. I could probably talk about that for an hour. But So it's based on preference. Now, we all prefer things the way we prefer them. It's not wrong the way we prefer it. It's just different from the way somebody else prefers it. So if a husband and wife are talking about a certain subject and the husband wants it this way and the wife wants it that way, one of those choices is not wrong. They're just different. And so we need to keep that in mind when we're talking to our spouse, when we're talking to our kids, or even just other people. Just because somebody wants it or prefers it to be a different way doesn't mean their way is wrong. We like things the way we like them, but they can like them the way they like them, and it's okay. So personality is just about preference. As I said, my personality, if you do the Myers-Briggs, my personality is INTJ. Myers-Briggs is a type of personality test. It has 16 buckets. My bucket is an INTJ. Introvert thinking, or introvert, intuitive thinking, judging. I'm 1% of the population, and I don't like people and I don't like emotions, but I'm a counselor and I've been good at it for 26 years. So go figure. Some people gravitate toward certain jobs with certain personalities. Like a lot of INTJs are engineers, rocket scientists, software coders, where they're in a dark room with a computer screen all day. That's just preference, okay? So people have to learn how to accommodate for the parts of their personality that get in the way of or cause problems with other personalities or relationships, okay? My wife is an ENFJ. So she has two letters the same, the N and the J, and two letters different. When you look up my personality on the Myers-Briggs website, INTJ, it will tell you, I think it's page 5, that there are two personalities that are the absolute best for an INTJ, and my wife's was one of them. But if you look on her page 5 about relationships, INTJ does not show up on her page. So she's the perfect personality for me, but I am not the perfect personality for her. So I have to learn how to make accommodations for all of the things that rub people the wrong way. And I do that. I do that in my office. I do that at home. Still a work in progress, but you have to learn how to do that. Myers-Briggs, the MBTI, that's one of them. There's a bunch of them. That's just the one that I used and I was trained on. If you want a free version of that, you can go to 16personalities.com. It's about 70 questions. You can take the test, and it will give you 35 pages of information about your personality. And I do use that with couples because they oftentimes wonder, well, why did they do this and why did they do that? Well, once we learn what your personalities are and we see where the conflicts are, then we can go, oh, that's their personality. That's the way God made them. They're not just being a jerk, which we oftentimes think, well, they're just being a jerk. No, it might be their personality as to why they do it that way. Okay, expectations. This is mainly about children. There's a book called The Hurried Child by Dr. David Elkind, who takes Erik Erikson's 8 stages of psychosocial development and applies them to children in current day settings, and basically says we, Americans, Western society, push our children to grow up too fast. We push them to engage in romantic relationships, think like an adult, act like an adult, and take on adult responsibilities before they can actually handle it, both physiologically, with their brain, and in relationships, okay? So don't expect children to grow up too fast. Let them be children as long as they need to be children, which is, up to 18 years old. Don't expect children to think like adults. This is about brain function. Remember, 25 years old, thinking like Jell-O, not a fully baked cookie. they're not going to think like adults. It's not all there yet, okay? And don't expect perfection. Expect children to make a lot of mistakes. You actually should want them to make mistakes because that's how they learn. Remember, muscles, ripping, learning, growing, relationships. They have to do that to learn how to do things the right way or more consistently or whatever. One of the most memorable conversations I had with one of my kids was driving somewhere in my truck. That's where all our conversations happen. And I can't remember what the subject was, but my question was, how do you think you get really good at doing something? How do you gain confidence in doing something? And the answer was, well, by doing it the right way. I said, no, by making mistakes. You have to make a whole bunch of mistakes with something to learn how to do it correctly, which is what gives you the confidence. The mistakes give you the confidence, not doing it perfectly. If you could do something perfectly right off, we'd all be Superman. That'd be great, but we'd all be Superman. That'd be terrible. So expect kids to make mistakes. Don't expect perfection. Confidence and responsibility are learned. They are not implanted. We oftentimes want to just put this thing in our child. We want them to be confident about something. We want them to be responsible about something. And so we use that word a lot and we try to put it in there. That's not how it happens. They have to learn it, and we just talked about they learn it by making mistakes. Everything is about relationship. I was originally trained in marriage and family therapy, family systems, which is all about relationship, not genetics, not A plus B equals C, not linear thinking, systemic thinking about why does this make sense in the context of relationships, not just looking at the individual person, which is what traditional psychology is all about. Influence versus control. Again, this is about we as parents should be seeking influence, not just controlling what our child thinks, what they do, where they're going. You can accomplish way more through influence in a child's life than you can through control. Control is going to breed compliance. Compliance breeds dissociation. Dissociation is lack of relationship. We want relationship, which by definition is going to bring more conflict into it. Invalidating environments is probably in my 26 years of doing this has been one of the biggest things that I've seen. A lot of mental health stuff comes from an environment that is invalidating. Invalidation is the process of indicating to a person by word or deed that what they think, feel, or have opinions about don't matter. Okay? Example, dishwasher. Kiddos loading the dishwasher. You're in the other room. You've told them how to do it. You've taught them how to do it. You've watched them do it umpteen zillion times. You walk into the kitchen where they are loading the dishwasher, not the way that you told them how to do it. So what do you say? Come on. I've told you 1,000 times you have to do it this way so that this and this and these are in the wrong place. And just get out of the way. I'll do it. That's invalidation. And that probably happens, umpteen zillion times in how many households in this country? An invalidating environment teaches a person not to have an opinion, not to have feelings, not to think on their own, because when they do those things and express them, they're told they're wrong. So they just stop. If it happens enough, over a long enough period of time, they will stop. And it attacks their identity. They become robotic. Because whenever they try to express uniqueness, they're shot down. So they begin to lose all of that, and they become this unidentifiable, robotic, compliant machine. Because That's what they've been taught. And that's where personality disorders come from. That's where a lot of mental health issues come from that cause or that bring people into my office. That's what I see a lot of. Okay, so we talked about, this is the triune brain theory. We talked about this a lot in the anxiety workshop. This is just a picture of the entire process. This is not the step-by-step. When a person has a chronic trauma, stress, or anxiety in their life, and that event happens, it enters through the limbic system, because the limbic system works 5 times faster than any other part of our brain, and it slams a gate down on the neocortex, so the thinking ability is taken away, other than fight, flight, and freeze, love and fear. The limbic system, because it doesn't do any thinking, hands it off to the brainstem, which is where the fight, flight, and fear, or fight, flight, and freeze, love, and fear thinking happens, and you get chaos in a person's life. How do we stop that? Breathing, coping, and grounding skills to allow us to take the gate away, allow us to think better. But the originator of the chronic trauma, stress, and anxiety needs to be dealt with so we can take this whole dynamic away and have regular thinking and regular problem solving. If we don't do that, this will happen the rest of that person's life. Another Bruce Perry picture. You got the picture of the brain there at the top. The 2 triangles is the notable piece on this slide. I have talked with many people, many couples, and used these triangles to explain a lot of their dynamic over the years. The upside down triangle is normal development, okay? That means that the wider the bar, the more time a person spends in that category in their day-to-day life. So normal development, they spend the most amount of time in cognition. That means thinking, the ability to think your way through something, okay? And they spend the least amount of time in survival, okay? And then regulation and social and emotional a little bit more than that. The right side up triangle is somebody who's had developmental trauma happen in their life, and they are surviving every moment of every day. I had a couple I was working with. The wife had multiple trauma issues prior to the age of 18, and they were having issues with being on time to places. I pulled this chart out, and I was talking to the husband about it, and I said, this is your wife, the right side up triangle. And he said, no, come on. I showed it to the wife, and she said, oh yeah, that's me. I'm surviving every day. From the moment I get up to the moment I go to bed, I'm just trying to survive that day. And he's like, what? And so she explained it all. And everything she said fit exactly in each layer of this triangle. She spent the least amount of time in cognition. She spent the most amount of time in survival, a little bit more time in regulation, but less time in social and emotional. She's just trying to get through the day, and he never realized how big of a deal that was in her day-to-day life until he saw this chart and heard her explain how that operated. It was eye-opening for him. He never knew that that's how she thought about or approached every day. And it made a huge difference in their relationship. He knew that she had traumatic events in her past, but he didn't know how they affected her on a day-to-day basis until this was explained. And it made all the difference.
How did that relate to them always being late?
Next slide. I think. Let me see. Nope. Okay, so I don't have a slide in here. When somebody has had, so your question was, how does that affect the time thing? When somebody has had, especially repeated, but even a single traumatic event in their life, and they are in survival mode, number one, it changes how their brain functions. Number two, time disappears from their equation, okay? So let's say that particular wife, her issue with time worked like this. They are sitting down for dinner, and she's making dinner, and it's a real quick make of dinner, and 30 minutes from now, they have to be somewhere, church or whatever. So they have 30 minutes, and they're 5 minutes from the church. So 30 minutes before, she starts making dinner, hot dogs or something. 5 minutes into, and it should take her 5 to 10 minutes to make the food, maybe even less. A couple of minutes, 3 to 5 minutes into that process, her kids, one of her kiddos, comes to her and presents a problem. Mommy, blah, 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 blah. She goes and deals with that, and that took 5 minutes. Comes back, finishes making dinner, puts it on the table, and everybody sits down. Now, in her head, it's been 5 minutes because it takes her 5 minutes to make dinner. Actuality, it's been more than 10 minutes, but she thinks it's only been 5. So now if it's been 10 minutes, they have to leave in 10 minutes. In her head, they have 15. So she's going to take the full 15 to eat, finish getting ready, and get out the door. But what does that do? Now it's 5 minutes until they have to be there, and it takes them 5 minutes to get there. So they're going to get there just on time. What happens while she's getting ready to go? Another kiddo, another problem. Mommy, mommy, mommy. Takes 5 minutes to deal with that. Now they're late, but she thinks they're on time because the 2 interruptions don't count in her head, because in her head, it takes 5 minutes to make dinner, it takes 5 minutes to eat, it takes 5 minutes to get ready, which means we'll be there 5 minutes early, but now she's late. Because she didn't account for the 2 interruptions, because in the head of a trauma survivor, time does not exist. Their biggest number one thing is not allowing that trauma thing to ever happen again, which is unrealistic, but so is the absence of time. So you could probably say, this is anecdotal, my experience, you could probably say that people who've experienced trauma struggle with being on time to things because their concept of time is different or non-existent than people who have not experienced trauma. So they're going, unless they have massive reminders and accommodations built into their day-to-day life, they're not going to be on time for anything. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Yep. Okay. So I said earlier, a 20-second hug, oxytocin. So a 20-second hug releases enough oxytocin hormone in our body, in our brain, which acts at 20 seconds, which acts as an anti-anxiety, anti-depression, pretty much the same as a medication in our body. Just a 20-second hug. Now, some of you want to go get a hug right now. That's how it works. When we spend time in close proximity with the people closest to us, relationally, this is how God made physical closeness, emotional closeness, relational closeness to work in our life, is through just a hug can give a person a shot of what they need in a brief amount of time. That's how powerful it is. So, some basics. We've talked about diet, sleep, and exercise before. Diet, sleep, and exercise are some of the biggest things for brain health. It's not just to fight depression and anxiety. It makes our brain healthy. The things that we believe about God, about the world, about ourselves, that's going to drive the bus on everything we think, feel, and do. Our beliefs, I could do a whole nother workshop on that. Our beliefs drive everything, good or bad, okay? Our identity is a huge portion of our brain health, because if we have an identity that says we're worthless, we're no good, we're unlovable, we're unredeemable, how's that going to affect how we think, how we feel, how we act in everyday relationships? Okay? They've studied this, and they've found that if we don't raise objection when somebody calls us a name or says bad things about us, when we call ourselves a name or say bad things about ourselves in our head, it affects our brain the same way. So we may stop somebody else from doing it, but we don't stop ourselves from doing it, it does the same thing. Let alone if we don't stop somebody else and we do it to ourselves, now we're getting a double whammy from that. Emotion regulation, we talked about that. There's a ton to be learned in that area alone about having regulated emotions, not wild and chaotic and out of control emotions. Boundaries and communication, we haven't even talked very much about those. They're huge in how we navigate relationships, how we exist in the world, how we understand what we're responsible for, what other people are responsible for, what to talk about, what not to talk about. One of the most common questions I ask teenagers is, well, did you talk to them, meaning their parents? Did you talk to them about that? No. Well, then of course you're having problems. You got to talk about these things. That's one of the most common questions heard in my office. So let me leave you with this. Philippians 4:8-9. Finally, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things. Did you know the Bible tells us 3 times what to think about and only 1 time what not to think about? It's kind of important what we think about. God wants us to think about good things. I'm not talking about positive psychology and all that crazy stuff. God is concerned about what we think about and doing it in a healthy way. And we need to be the light, the salt, the help for other people who are struggling with these things on a daily basis. We've talked about in some of the others, what we can do. What you can do is encourage people toward more healthy activities with their brain. Diet, sleep, exercise, all the things that are on that previous slide. But communicating, having relationships, how they interact with their children, with their friends, with anybody. All of that stuff contributes to a healthy brain or an unhealthy brain. So, questions, comments. One of the people always want to know about traumatic brain injuries. I'm not a doctor. Traumatic brain injuries happen. They can impede functionality in the brain. God can do whatever he wants whenever he wants. He can make all kinds of things happen in a person's life, whether it's switching hemispheres or not, that we can't explain. But a traumatic brain injury, absent of any intervention by God or anybody else, that's going to affect physiologically brain function. And as far as a basic position, there is no overcoming that. Yes?
You were talking about positive and negative voices from the outside and positive and negative voices from the inside.
Mm-hmm.
For me, someone can be super, super negative, can be screaming at me, and it's fine. It doesn't affect me whatsoever. I can just take it up in the moment.
Right.
Every time. And so I'm kind of ambivalent there, but when it comes to internal voices, I usually am really good at regulating, I don't downgrade myself at all, really.
Okay.
So it's like, I can experience it, I can have someone talking down from the outside, I can just take it from the inside, I won't really,
Right.
just talking that, I guess.
So you would be in the minority. Most people, when somebody's yelling at them, downgrading them, saying mean things, whatever it is, people are going to take that personal. It is a personal attack. If a person has really good boundaries, they won't even allow that stuff in. They won't take it in and give it any kind of value whatsoever, kind of like what you described. However, most people don't have good boundaries. They let that stuff in, and it begins to play on what they do think about themselves, especially if this person is a close relationship to them. So if it's a parent, if it's an uncle, if it's a coach, if it's somebody who means something to them, and we're talking about a child, they're going to begin to question themselves and what they think. If it's another adult and they have a trauma history or anything, anxiety or depression oriented in their life, they're going to struggle to handle that in a healthy way. They're going to allow that in and at least question it. If not, it's going to feed a negative that they already have. So the answer is boundaries. The answer is understanding that what somebody else says in our direction doesn't necessarily mean what they say. If it comes out of somebody else's mouth, it's not about you because it came from their mouth. So we need to learn as people, and we need to teach our children not to take things personally. That's a big struggle for a lot of people. Yeah.
While you're talking, I was able to form the question a little bit better. I'm good at shutting down internal voices that are negative, but I don't care about external voices. Should I be better at shutting down external voices? I just let them say whatever they want and let them have the thing. Should I stop them in the moment and say no? Because I don't.
Not necessarily. So the question is, if we're good with boundaries on the inside, should we? But we don't do anything on the outside. Should we do anything with that? Not necessarily. We do want influence. We want influence from our spouse, from our children, from the people closest to us. That doesn't mean they get to decide for us, but they have weight and value in the feedback that they give us. If it's a stranger, if it's another adult that has no investment in our life, should we listen to that? I'm not really going to care what a stranger says on the streets of New York City. I don't live there. If it's somebody that I have some kind of relationship with, they might be giving me feedback that's valuable. I might need to listen to that. So we do need to remain open to it, but how much weight we give it is a whole different thing. Yeah. Yeah.
Somebody had asked this question before, I was curious. So in staging of development, brain development, when people are getting married, like in their early 20s, what role does that relationship play in their development as they turn 25 and become fully educated?
So the question is, somebody who gets into a relationship, gets married prior to the age of, in their young 20s, prior to the age of 25, how does that affect everything? If they're both under 25, you still got two developing brains. They're going to have a massive impact on each other as far as developing, and that could be a good thing or a bad thing, depending on which way they're going. And it's okay. They're both kind of growing up together and growing into a more mature position as an adult. And they're going to be more, they're probably going to experience extremes more. Emotional extremes, thinking extremes, because they're not a fully baked cookie yet. So tendency to go to an extreme positive or an extreme negative, because maturity is in the middle. So that's the piece that's still developing. It's not a good or a bad. It's just recognize where you're at and what the hurdles might be, and then when you get to 25, you're going to notice a big difference in each other. You're not going to see a whole lot of change in personality. You'll see more changes in body function and presentation, but not personality. That's probably definitely going to stay the same. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Yep. Okay. Over here.
Does having kids speed up that process? Like if two 18-year-olds get married and have kids, will they mature faster because they're kind of forced into a position of maturity?
So that's a good question. Does having kids prior to 25 change developmentally? I I heard somebody talk about that once. I really liked what they had to say. It was not from a scientific or professional opinion. It was a more anecdotal opinion, but I happen to agree with it. When we're 18 and we jump out into life, we can be as selfish as we want, including even if we get into a relationship. And let's say two people who are 18, 19, 20 years old, they get into a relationship, they get married, they start having kids right away. Having children forces the responsibility on a person. If they're in a committed relationship, they're starting a family, it forces responsibility on them in a way that if they didn't have kids, they wouldn't act and do things and think about things in a certain way. You know, when you have a kid, you have a more committed position, and now you have to provide for somebody who is utterly helpless. And that's different than, yeah, we don't have kids, we can stay up till 1 o'clock in the morning, we can go and do all these things, and we have no weight on us. I mean, we can do whatever we want. Versus, you know what, we got to get the kid to bed. We got to be up early in the morning because the kid's going to be up early in the morning. You know, all that kind of stuff changes how you think about and the logistics of day-to-day life. So what this person said was, if you want to be responsible and you want to learn responsibility from an extreme position, go find a good relationship, get married, and have kids at a young age. That's a pretty radical idea, given that the average age of marriage, first marriage in this country, is 28. Not a lot of people are doing that. You know, from 20, let's say 18 to 28, that's 10 years of doing things however you want, building in a lot of selfishness, a lot of independence, a lot of doing things the way I want them to be done. Now I have a baby to care for. Holy cow, I can't do X, Y, and Z all the time. That changes things dramatically. I think it's a good thing. You go back a couple of hundred years, they were having babies at 15, 16 years old. Especially American frontier times, you know, the land rush and all that. They were getting married at 14, 15 years old. So, not that that's the best thing to do, I'm not promoting that, but you look at generationally how things play out. Waiting until 28 has not given better results than getting married and having kids at younger ages. Those had better results from a lot of measures. So, good question. Yeah.
Two questions. So working with kids, we were talking about how developmentally being able to best guide them, let them have their failures and things like that. As we as adults and facilitators of that, is there any, as you've worked with kids, is there any ways, tips or tricks to kind of have our mindset be, oh, this is a project, or this is a person where we need to not jump to conclusions, but allow them that process of failure, or is it just a discipline that we need to discipline ourselves in having that mindset?
I think it's the latter one, because when you're dealing primarily with kids, you got to slow everything down, throw in a huge dose of patience, and understand that half of what they say is going to be chaos. And what they do, yeah. So understanding that you know, those exuberant growth periods and brain development and all that stuff is huge. Understanding that they're going to override their thinking with emotionality is huge. Understanding that they are seeking individuality and uniqueness, but they might be coming from an environment of invalidation. So they may have one face they show the family, but a different face they show their friends, and a different face they show at church, and a different face they show at baseball. They could have different faces based on how those environments treat them. So yeah, there's a couple of major points to keep in mind when dealing with a kiddo, especially if you're sitting down having a one-on-one conversation, where, you know, they're talking about something that's important to them in their life and they're struggling with it. most of the time it's going to be, yeah, I get it. That makes sense. Here's some things that you can try, you know, and giving them advice or guidance in certain areas, but it's not going to be complete. You probably don't have access to every area, but they're just a work in progress and are going to be for a while. And all of those factors are going to contribute to that. Yeah. Yep.
So in turning 25,
Hey, the dinger's about to go off. He's a fully baked cookie.
is there some developmental things I should be aware of in my own mind, my own head? Because there are times I feel like thinking through processes is good, and I feel there's other times it can feel like over logical, if that makes sense, or like
Yeah.
kind of can dip into pessimism a bit, even like somebody super optimistic.
Sure.
Or just becoming frustrated with certain things, or experiencing things. Is there things developmentally like that are normal but not necessarily seen as normal? Or
No, I think you're, congratulations on being a fully baked cookie. And it's not I guess the best thing I could say is read books. Just read about some of this stuff. And not scientific books that I would read, but more built for customer books about relationships. Everything that you said, there are so many factors that affect all of that. It's not one thing. And, you know, development doesn't end at 25, it ends when you go in the ground. I mean, you're always a work in progress. So there's a lot of pieces that go into that. How your past impacts it, your personality impacts it, how your communication style impacts it, past relationships and what you've learned, your beliefs. There's so many things that enter into that equation. You can't pin it down to one thing. If you are curious about the subject, if you like the subject, yeah, read books about it. Read the Boundaries book. Read the Gottman books. There's tons of stuff. I would say, you know, I entered graduate school at 26 and exited at 28, and I didn't know nearly as much as I do now because I've read a whole lot more now. If I had read a lot of books earlier, I would have understood stuff a lot sooner. It's almost like just putting all that in there and understanding it, it makes a huge difference. Yeah.
It's a hard question.
Okay, any others? Well, thank you guys, appreciate it, and let me know if you have any other questions, and we'll see you next week.